First of all, I would like to start by echoing my president, Ambassador Ronald Lauder, in commending the ICRC for having this event. We met for the first time with the president, with Peter Maurer, about 3 months ago, and spoke about having a discussion of this kind. And I'm extremely happy that today we are sitting in this room and we're opening the floor now for the discussion. May 2015 marked the 70 years since the liberation of the Nazi concentration camps and the end of the Second World War. The purpose of this panel is to discuss the ICRC and the international community's failure to act or react vigorously to the persecution of Jews and other victims by the Third Reich. The panel discussion wishes to reflect on these issues, share the lessons learned from them, and review the legal and political tools established to prevent and respond in the future to the genocide and other large-scale atrocities. I now would like to give the floor to our distinguished speakers, and we'll start with Professor Lipstadt.
Thank you, and good evening. I begin with one small anecdote. Over this past weekend, I spent time with a number of people who are quite familiar with the history of the Shoah, with the history of the Holocaust. And when I mentioned that I was coming to Geneva directly to participate in this, they used the term that those of you who are from the United States or know American presidential history will be familiar with. They said, "Give him hell." That was something that Harry Truman was told, "Give him hell, Harry." And I stopped them and I said, you know, the ICRC's record, which I'm going to talk about in one moment, during the final solution, during the Third Reich, was not a noble one. But if its record since, particularly since the mid-90s, as we heard from Ronald Lauder just a few moments ago, is something that makes giving hell and rebuke not at all necessary. In fact, if anything, it's a model to other organizations on how one confronts one's wrongs and tries to address them. But to talk about the historical situation, I'd like to frame my remarks within two contexts. One, and in fact it's alluded to in the posters and the exhibition outside, one is the dichotomy between information and knowledge. Some of my earliest work on the history of the Shoah was on the American press coverage. And I scoured hundreds of newspapers, including, but not only the New York Times, and figured out that there was a tremendous amount of information there. Yet for most people, it did not result in knowledge. They could not grasp, they could not fully understand, they could not fathom, I guess is the best word, what was going on. The question, of course, in relation to the history of the ICRC is when did that information become knowledge? When did it become fully aware of what was happening? And I would argue it was earlier than most other organizations and certainly virtually all individuals. Secondly, and possibly more importantly in terms of this conversation, often historians of the Shoah speak of a tripartite of perpetrators, victims, and bystanders. In recent years, a number of historians have begun to argue that the term bystanders is not a useful term. It doesn't really reflect what we're talking about, certainly for many of the players. And they've begun to argue that we should use the term enablers, because it's much more telling. Some of the bystanders had no power to do anything, and we acknowledge that. Not everyone was an enabler. But I think there were those individuals and certainly those organizations, and I would say the same thing, I say this about the ICRC, and I certainly would say about it, the Vatican, that rather than being bystanders, they were enablers. They had the power, maybe not to stop it, but to send a message that this was not acceptable. And possibly by the 40s, it was too late to send that message. But they had the power to send that message, certainly during the 1930s, and failed to do so. So I think if you keep that in mind, that may frame some of the things I'm going to say. The enabler, of course, sends the message that what you're doing may not be right, but we don't think it's so terribly wrong. Or if it doesn't send the message, the perpetrator, in this case certainly the Third Reich, interprets it that way. We're not far from Evian, and I would argue that the Evian conference sent the same kind of message. What you're doing is wrong, but we don't want those people. And the message was gotten quite clearly. And I'm very honored to be in the presence of Cornelio Sommaruga, who has played such an important role in the change of, or the acknowledgement of the shortcomings of the ICRC, and is a model for other organizations and individuals. But the historical data, what is the historical data? Some of which is outside, but not all of it. Let's begin with 1933. Remember that the time to stop a genocide is usually not once it's begun. The time to stop a genocide is before it's begun. And you don't know it's going to be a genocide, but it means you've got to raise the bar pretty high when there is intolerance and there is persecution. And in June 1933, the New York Times reported that the German Red Cross, the Deutsche Rote Kreuz, the DRK, was going to completely Aryanize. It was going to fire any Jew who worked for it, eliminate any Jew who worked for it, and that all its functionaries, all its bureaucrats, all its nurses, male and female, would be Aryans. Of course, a ridiculous term, but the term that was then used. At this point in the Third Reich was 120 days old. And if you look at what it was doing, it was testing the waters, whether with the book burning, whether with the one-day boycott in April of 1933. It was testing the waters to see how far other organizations, NGOs, other nations would allow it to go. Imagine what might have happened had the ICRC said, this runs counter to the most basic ideas of the ICRC. This will not stand. We will have nothing to do with you. Might it have stopped the Third Reich from what it eventually did? I don't know. That's counterfactual history. But it certainly would have sent a message. And still in the 30s, in 1939, and this comes from the ICRC website, the then president of the organization approached the German Red Cross to arrange for ICRC delegates to visit the Jews from Vienna who had been deported to Poland. The request was rejected. And the Germans made it clear that they had no interest in discussing the matter further. They didn't want this. This was outside, what they considered outside the purview of the ICRC. At that point, from that point on, the ICRC did not address the question of the treatment of the Jews. It asked about, quote unquote, victims of mass arrests. It asked about deportees. It asked about trainloads of deportees, but it never mentioned Jews. By the way, and President Roosevelt at certain points did the same thing. He said, I don't want to mention Jews because I don't want to suggest that this is being done to one particular group. But it was being done to one particular group. It sounds so ridiculous now looking back. So here is another failure or an acquiescence to what the Third Reich wanted. But of course, it's during the war itself, and beginning late 41, 1942, certainly by August 42, when information about systematic annihilation, not just killings and massacres here and there, but systematic annihilation of Jews throughout Europe. At this point already, German Jews are being brought to the east where they're being mass murdered. That is when it becomes most disturbing. Again, according to ICRC documents and records, and according to the recollections of Dr. Gerhard Riegner, whose name must be mentioned in this context, because if there is a hero, he was the representative of the World Jewish Congress here in Switzerland, and he tried desperately to get NGOs, to get other organizations, including and especially the ICRC. And in most cases, what he met with was doors slammed in his face. He repeatedly asked then ICRC Vice President Karl Burkhardt to act, to do something, and Burckhardt showed no inclination to do so. What was Regner asking for? Regner was asking for big things. He wasn't asking for small actions, but what was happening was quite big and demanded large actions. He asked that Red Cross delegates be sent to the areas where ghettoization was taking place, where deportation was taking place, and so that there might be independent external witnesses. Maybe this would mitigate some of the horrors. He wanted the Red Cross to find some way to confer on those people who had been deported, those people who were interned in the camps, some sort of legal status equivalent to prisoners of war. Maybe it wouldn't have been possible, but it never even got a hearing. It was shut down right at the outset. Help people who are starving. Let's try to get food to them. Let's urge other neutral governments to open their doors to their refugees. He looked for a partner in the ICRC. And what he found was, in most cases, total rejection. The ICRC explained its action, that its mandate was to care for the approximately 4 million POWs, and anything that might just jeopardize their fate, it would not do. And then it made some arguments today which sound almost ludicrous. It said, of course, the German treatment of the Jews was a domestic matter, and it's not within the ICRC's purview to intervene. Or that the condition and plight of Polish Jews was also not within its purview because A, they were civilians, B, Poland had ceased to exist as a nation after the end of September 1939. Therefore, it was outside the ICRC's mandate. Yes, there were visits to concentration camps, and the most famous one is, of course, cited the June 1944 visit by Dr. Maurice Rossel to Theresienstadt. I urge you, if you haven't seen Claude Lanzmann's A Visitor from the Living, which is an outtake of Shoah, didn't make it into Shoah. It's an hour interview with Rossel. Watch that, and you will see something that is truly disturbing. It's filmed in the 70s, but even then, Rossel was much more likely in the interview to blame the victims, the internees at Theresienstadt, for not coming forward and telling him the truth and the facts of what they were facing. It was such a disconnect from the reality that they were facing that I still find it shocking. And what about the POWs, prisoner of war, whom the ICRC said fell within its mandate? Well, even there, when it came to Jewish victims, it failed. For instance, the ICRC knew that in many instances, Jewish POWs were separated from their fellow POWs and treated much more harshly. Nevertheless, it refused to lodge any protest. It didn't protest when many thousands of Polish Jewish POWs were removed from POW camps and sent to prison camps in Poland where either they were worked to death or murdered. Yes, there were packages sent. There were things that were done. But when you step back and look at the whole picture, you see one, and again, this is something the ICRC so nobly acknowledges, which is it's a hard thing to do, but certainly has done in a way, as I said before, that is a model for other organizations and other governments, its failures. And maybe if we're talking about failures, we must, not maybe, but we must also cite those who broke with the model, who didn't go along. ICRC employees, ICRC functionaries, Roland Marty, the chief ICRC delegate in Berlin, who tried to help Jews but was unsuccessful. Or Friedrich Born, who's mentioned again in the exhibit, the ICRC representative. We know about Wallenberg, but fewer people don't know about Born and should, who recruited 3,000 Jews to work for the ICRC in Budapest, thereby giving them protection, and then issued 15,000 permits that had no legal standing at all. They were good because they protected them, but if the ICRC had paid attention, as it had earlier, so much to legal matters, they would have said these are worthless things, but they knew that piece of paper might save those Jews, and they actually did. André de Pilar, ICRC Geneva representative, to whom Gerhard Riedner, in his book, says the Jewish people owe him, quote, a profound debt of gratitude. He kept Regner informed about what was going on. He tried to pass on information as much as he possibly could. And of course, there were, during the final days of the war, significant steps by the ICRC to arrange for the surrender of certain camps and to protect certain groups of Jewish internees and slave laborers from being killed in those final days. On some level, I'm repeating both what you said and what you said, but maybe again it bears repeating. We are standing in the midst, and we are here. I am here today in part as at the invitation of the ICRC, an organization which has made its reputation on being a moral entity, one that speaks for humanity. We look back at a session. We look back at a period when it failed. When it failed in facing one of the most astounding crimes of humanity. It probably couldn't have stopped it, certainly by the 40s, but it could have done far more. Having said that, and again to echo Ron Lauder from a few moments ago, if the ICRC failed 70 years ago, the face it shows to the world today, the way it has confronted its history, the way it has taken its history in hand and said, this shall not happen on our watch again, is something that sends a very positive message. And for that, I think all those who are involved in it, and certainly you all deserve great commendation, not commendation. It is a model that other governments, other countries, and other NGOs certainly could pay heed to. Thank you very much.
It is very much an honor, and one that weighs heavily, to speak today at this commemorative event. There is so much that is beyond words, and yet so much that must not be beyond words. I speak for myself, and not for Médecins Sans Frontières, or any other organization. In my own experience as a humanitarian doctor, I've seen famine, I've seen war, I've seen its crimes, and I've seen genocide. There is no escape from what you know. And let me draw on this to address the question, how far have we come? When Auschwitz was liberated by the Russians on January 27 in 1945, only 7,000 desperate souls remained precariously alive from among 1.3 million that had been sent there to be exterminated. In all, 6 million Jews and 6 million Poles, Russians, Roma, homosexuals, and political prisoners were murdered in a network of 20,000 camps established by the Nazis across Europe. Here, the guilty were literally stripped of their identity and social meaning and banished to the outskirts of the proverbial city. At Bergen-Belsen, liberated by the Allied forces in April of 1945, a mere 60,000 people remained. Bergen-Belsen may well have been bombed had it not been for a prisoner who escaped, bringing testimony of the reality of the concentration camp to the approaching Allied forces. The Holocaust has been variously interpreted as the culmination of anti-Semitism, of racism at its worst, as a crime against humanity, or a crime against the human condition. The Shoah, the speaking of it, the challenging of the moral, the political, and the humanitarian choices in it, and the struggle against the totalitarian erasure of the other in the name of Superman that led to the Shoah, this has been the defining feature of a fragile, cosmopolitan morality that has staggered into existence since. Now, Simone Weil, in her commentary on Homer's Iliad, a commentary written in the summer of 1940 after the fall of France to the Nazis, remarked that a, quote, trembling marks those who now feel a nothingness in their own presence. This is a trembling that I first witnessed in Somalia, and then in Afghanistan, in Rwanda, in Zaire, in Kosovo, in South Sudan, and in too many other places of crisis. It is a quivering of those who are reduced to a bare life that is no longer seen as inherently sacred. It is into this silent place that the humanitarian acts. And in speaking from this place, the voice of outrage is raised. It is a voice that bears witness to the plight of the victim, and one that demands for the victim both assistance and protection, so that the silence does not go unheard. Now, the refusal to accept the unacceptable is Médecins Sans Frontières' founding myth, and bearing witness is central to this. It is commonly acknowledged that MSF began in the context of the Biafran Civil War. French doctors, originally working for the French Red Cross, rejected a predetermined neutrality that imposed a passive complicity with the Nigerian government, which had been accused of committing genocide. The silence of all parties, including the ICRC, about the annihilation of the Jews under the Third Reich formed the backdrop of this accusation. Now, at its best, politics is an imperfect human project. It is very much at its worst when we delude ourselves in thinking that politics can be perfect. Now, in Rwanda, in 1994, I was MSF's head of mission in Kigali, the country's capital city. I was there as a humanitarian doctor. It was a place with a very particular politics, the criminal politics of genocide. It was a brutal, horrible time, a time of rational and state-planned evil. Nearly 1 million people, virtually all Tutsis, were butchered to death in 14 short weeks. Bodies filled the streets of the capital city, and the gutters alongside a hospital that we managed to keep open, those gutters literally ran red with human blood. And one night, after many long hours of surgery, a girl of about 9 told me how she escaped murder at the hands of the Interahamwe killing squads. The squads were part of an organized government plan to erase the very existence of the Tutsi people from Rwanda. Through an interpreter, the little girl told me, and I quote, "My mother hid me in the latrine. I saw through the hole. I watched them hit her with machetes. I watched my mother's arm fall into my father's blood on the floor. And I cried without noise in the toilet." Now, many have described genocide and similar human cruelties as unspeakable. But they are as unspeakable as they are undoable. As human beings, we are capable of doing genocide. And doctors cannot stop this crime. But the little girl in the latrine had no voice. And we had a responsibility to speak out against what we knew. And we did not speak into the wind. We spoke with a clear intent to rouse the outrage of public consciousness around the world. On one side of the front line, Médecins Sans Frontières worked under the emblem and the authority of the Red Cross and under the courageous leadership of Philippe Gaillard, the head of mission for the ICRC in Rwanda at the time. And both organizations actively denounced the genocide as it was happening. This was the first such active denouncement of genocide in the history of the Red Cross. MSF also called for military intervention under the United Nations to stop the criminal politics of genocide. How far have we come? Well, Churchill called it the crime that has no name. The Holocaust from 1933 to 1945 was for Hannah Arendt the, quote, apotheosis of the experience of modernity. It was the rupture with civilization that shattered all existing ideas of progress, all feelings of optimism, all previously engraved images of Europe as a civilized community, all notions of the innocence of modern political thought. And since the Shoah, there have been genocidal mass atrocities in Bangladesh, in East Timor, in Cambodia, in Guatemala, in Bosnia, in Rwanda, and in Darfur, Sudan. The knowledge of the Holocaust is forever rooted in a morality that knows first what is wrong and that aspires to protect in the name of what is right. Nothing thus far legitimizes the coalescing and the fragile cosmopolitan morality of human rights and humanitarianism more than the slogan, "Never Again." The Shoah is the horrific moral genesis and was the justification for a universal legal response in the Nuremberg trials, the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, the Declaration of Universal Human Rights, and for human rights more generally, so that they have a central place in the preamble to Article 1 of the United Nations Charter. These were specifically designed to prevent another Holocaust and another Nazi party. How far have we come? Well, absent Srebrenica and other massacres, according to the 2007 ruling of the International Court of Justice, not only was genocide in Bosnia prevented because of the deterrent effects of punishment, the duty to prevent genocide had its own autonomous scope, which was both normative and compelling. And following the Cold War hiatus, we've seen an imperfect proliferation in the number and variety of state and non-state actors and mechanisms and multi-state initiatives. Multiple interventions eventually gave rise to normative support for an imperfect International Criminal Court and a deeply imperfect responsibility to protect. 21 years ago, when the genocide in Rwanda ended, there was no such thing as an International Criminal Court. Its creation in 2002 is a seminal, and I mean that word very precisely, and imperfect human achievement over impunity. Now, for the first time in human history, those individuals who violate the laws of war can be held to account if their own governments fail to do so, and no one, not even a sitting head of state, can claim to be above the law. Now, law does not make us just and good, but it can if it is claimed and enforced, protect us from what is not just and good. Gaps left by the narrow definition of genocide in the 1948 Convention have been partially filled by the enlargement of the ambit of crimes against humanity during the 90s. And under the guidance of the Red Cross, international humanitarian law has had and will continue to have revision as the context, the technology, and the nature of warfare changes. And yet, none of this has erased the politics of power that willingly sacrifices some, and nor have these dampened war as one among many means for the exercise of that power. 70 years later, the Shoah has become part of, and most significantly, remains a catalyst for a remaking of our collective story of ourselves, a story that must put human dignity at the center of the political project. How far have we come? Far, but not far enough. Last week, 1,200 people drowned while fleeing knowingly into dangerous Mediterranean waters. Having given over their safety to human smugglers, they sought refuge in an uncertain fate, from a known fate that is certainly repressive. Each dead person is the definition of a refugee. That this must be stated illuminates just how far humanitarianism and human rights have penetrated beyond the never again of the Holocaust. The Economist, of all places, wrote yesterday, after the crimes of the Second World War, countries made solemn undertakings never again to abandon innocent people to persecution and conflict. The Economist continued to write, Europe's boat people expose the failings of countries with a duty to shelter them. In Europe, that starts with a breakdown of ethics. Let me close with this thought. The Holocaust must always be the particular of the Jewish people. And yet, having emerged from the particularism of the Holocaust, never again, and all that has followed from it, has become a universalist aspiration that risks dissipating into the ether of the non-specific, should it not be rooted again and again in the multiple particularities of contemporary wrongs. Bearing witness from a place once described as I, thou, is central to this rooting, so that always we can begin again. Thank you very much for the privilege of speaking at this most important of commemorative events. Thank you.
Thank you.